They say the most painful words come from the people you sacrificed everything for. I spent 32 years pushing a mop through a billion-dollar company so my son could chase a life I'd never taste. At his wedding, I stood to honor his mother we lost years ago, and he grabbed the mic, looked at his new in-laws, and called me a worthless janitor. The room laughed. I sat down in my rented suit, but the man beside me wasn't laughing. Gerald Apex, the quiet billionaire who'd eaten lunch with me every Tuesday for 20 years, leaned close and whispered, "Henry, I think it's time your son learned exactly whose name is on the mortgage of his new firm." Welcome back to Dad's True Revenge. You're going to want to see how the man with the mop bucket just became the only person in the room holding every key. This is Henry Cole, a custodian at Apex Global Logistics. For 32 years he cleaned their floors, while his son Marcus climbed into a world of private equity and lake houses. Henry never asked for credit, just a future for his boy. But when Marcus publicly disowned him in front of 300 guests, he didn't just break a father's heart. He shattered an invisible truce that had been protecting his entire new world. Because the quiet billionaire sitting next to Henry wasn't just his boss. He was the man who held the deed to Marcus's firm, and he'd just decided to call in a debt of a very different kind. You need to understand who Henry Cole really is. And that starts 32 years ago, when he walked into Apex Global Logistics for the first time. Not as a janitor, but as a young widower with a 5-year-old boy named Marcus, and a mountain of medical debt. Henry's wife had died 6 months earlier from a cancer that drained their savings and their hope in equal measure. He took the custodial job because it was the only one that let him work while Marcus was in school. He never left. Every morning at 5, he put on the same gray uniform and pushed his cart down the empty hallways, polishing the floors of a company that would one day be worth $9 billion. He knew every corner of that building, including the small break room on the executive floor where the coffee was better and the silence was deeper. And it was there, on a Tuesday in 1994, that he met Gerald Apex. Gerald had built his empire from scratch, a logistics giant that was devouring competitors the way a whale consumes plankton. But that morning, he wasn't a billionaire. He was a man sitting alone at a plastic table, staring at a cold cup of coffee, trying to figure out how to tell his board that a hostile takeover was about to gut his company. Henry walked in, nodded, and said the first thing that came to his mind. "You look like you could use some donuts." Gerald laughed for the first time in weeks, and from that moment, every Tuesday at 9, the two men sat in that break room together. Henry never asked for favors. Gerald never offered platitudes. They just talked about baseball, about tomatoes, about being fathers. Gerald's own son had died in a car accident a decade earlier, and he told Henry once, quietly, that those Tuesdays were the only thing keeping him tethered to anything that felt real. But while Henry scrubbed floors, his son Marcus was busy rewriting his own history. The boy who had watched his father come home smelling of industrial cleaner grew up with a fierce, almost desperate need to escape that smell. He was brilliant, no one denies that. He earned a full scholarship to Wharton, got his MBA, and by 31 had launched his own boutique investment firm specializing in turning around distressed logistics companies. It was a cruel irony that Henry tried not to notice. The son had built a career dismantling the very kind of companies his father had spent a lifetime cleaning, and the firm, Apex Solutions, was named not after Gerald's company, but after a word that sounded strong and cutting edge. At least that's what Marcus told his investors. He never told them about the other Apex, the one where his father still worked every single day. When Marcus got engaged to a woman named Eliza Whittington, whose family owned a private equity group in Connecticut, Henry was genuinely happy. He wore the same rented tuxedo he'd worn to company holiday parties for 10 years and practiced his toast in front of the bathroom mirror until the words felt steady. But he knew something was shifting. Marcus had started referring to him only as "my dad" during phone calls, never mentioning his job, never inviting him to the city. At the wedding rehearsal, Marcus introduced him to the Whittingtons with a hand wave and a single line, "That's Henry. Not my father. Not the man who paid for my first semester of college by working double shifts. Just Henry." The wedding itself was held at a restored manor in the Hudson Valley, the kind of place where chandeliers are insured for more than most people's houses. 300 guests in gowns and custom suits sat at long tables draped in ivory silk. Henry sat in the back, near a service door, because Marcus had said the head table was for immediate family. Gerald Apex was there because the Whittington patriarch had invited him, hoping to secure a logistics contract. He spotted Henry, walked past the entire receiving line, and sat down right beside him. When the time came for toasts, Henry stood, his hands trembling only slightly, and spoke about his late wife, about the joy of watching Marcus grow, about how proud she would have been. It was sincere, a man pouring out the last unbroken piece of his heart. Then Marcus stood. He adjusted the microphone, smiled at his new in-laws, and said the words that turned a ballroom into a courtroom. "Thanks, Dad, but I think I turned out fine despite growing up with a worthless janitor for a father." Some of us were meant for more than mop buckets. The polite laughter that rippled through the room wasn't the kind that includes you. It was the kind that isolates you completely. Henry felt the room tilt. His fork was still in his hand, and he couldn't remember picking it up. Gerald, beside him, didn't laugh. Instead, he bent his dinner fork with his bare hands, the silver tines curling inward like they'd been hit with a hammer. Then he turned to Henry and whispered the promise that will define everything that happens next. But here's the detail no one at that wedding understood, and it's the reason I'm telling you this story in the first place. The Whittingtons had invested nearly $5 million into Marcus's firm. But that was seed money. The real capital, the kind that keeps the lights on and the office lease paid, came from a private secured loan Marcus had taken out just 8 months before the wedding. The lender was a quiet holding company called Apex Capital. Gerald Apex owned it outright. Marcus had never connected the dots because the transaction was handled by intermediaries, and he'd been too busy celebrating his own genius to read the fine print. Gerald had effectively owned the mortgage on every single asset Marcus possessed, and the only reason he'd issued the loan in the first place was because Henry had mentioned once, over stale break-room donuts, that his son was trying to start a business, and he hoped someone would give the kid a chance. So Gerald gave him a chance, and he'd done it solely out of respect for the man who cleaned his floors. Marcus had been walking around with his father's invisible fingerprints all over his success, and he had no idea. The morning after the wedding, Gerald's car pulled up to Henry's small house before sunrise. The two men sat at Henry's kitchen table, the same table where Marcus used to do his homework, while the smell of pine cleaner dried on his father's shirt. Gerald placed a leather folder between them. Inside was the original loan agreement, a clause that allowed the lender to call in the entire balance at any time with 30 days' notice, and a single typed letter addressed to Marcus Hale. The letter began, "Dear Mr. Hale, your comment at your wedding reception has come to our attention." Gerald didn't need Henry to say a word. He just said, "I loved my son. I would have given anything for one more Tuesday with him. That boy of yours doesn't understand what he threw away. But he's about to learn that the man he humiliated isn't a worthless janitor. He's the only reason his company exists at all. The letter was a demand for immediate repayment of $4.7 million due in 30 days. It would collapse Marcus's firm overnight, expose him to his new in-laws as a fraud, and strip him of every single thing he had publicly valued more than his own father. The question wasn't whether Gerald would send it. The question was whether Henry would let him. And as Henry stared at that letter, I need you to understand the impossible weight of what was sitting on that table. Because Henry Cole had spent his entire life protecting that boy. And now he was holding the one thing that could destroy him completely. The decision he made in the next 60 seconds will rewrite the life of everyone at that wedding. Henry picked up the letter. He held it between two fingers the way you hold something that might burn you and said, so quietly Gerald had to lean forward to hear it, "Let me take it to him myself." Gerald didn't argue. He knew this was not a negotiation between two executives. It was a reckoning between a father and a son who had spent his entire life telling himself a story about weakness. Henry Cole folded the letter into the chest pocket of his jacket. The same jacket he'd worn to every parent-teacher conference Marcus ever had, and said he'd deliver it at 10 the next morning, in the gleaming corner office of Apex Solutions, where Marcus sat trading on a name he didn't know was borrowed. But before that meeting could happen, something else arrived. At 8:45 the next morning, Henry's phone rang. It was Eliza Whittington, Marcus's wife, her voice already half-shattered. Her father had called an emergency family meeting. Marcus had been boasting for weeks about a massive capital injection he was about to close from a mystery backer who would triple the firm's valuation overnight. The Whittingtons, ever eager, had leaked word to their investment circle. And now a consortium of silent partners was expecting a term sheet by end of day. Except the mystery backer didn't exist. Marcus had fabricated the entire thing to buy himself more runway after a disastrous bet on a logistics startup that had quietly imploded 3 months prior. He had been hiding the losses from everyone, including his own wife, using shell invoices and deferred interest payments that were set to go nuclear in less than 40 days. The $4.7 million loan from Apex Capital was already one missed payment away from default, and the Whittingtons' $5 million was locked in a holding company that Marcus had secretly leveraged as collateral for a secondary debt he took out to cover his tracks. Eliza was sobbing now. Her father had told her that if the secret debt didn't vanish by Friday, he would file fraud charges against his own son-in-law. Henry listened to all of it, standing in his kitchen in the same flannel shirt he'd worn to mop floors in before dawn for 3 decades, and he realized the letter in his pocket wasn't a grenade anymore. It was already shrapnel. The explosion had happened without Gerald ever dropping an envelope on a desk. The boy had lit the fuse himself the moment he decided to pretend he was bigger than the man who raised him. Henry didn't tell Eliza what he was holding. He just said, "Sweetheart, ask your father to hold the call until noon." Then he called Gerald and told him to meet him in the parking garage of Apex Global in 30 minutes. Gerald brought his legal counsel, a woman named Diane, who had never seen the inside of the custodial break room, but had drafted the original loan agreement and knew exactly which page held the kill switch. She laid it out on the hood of Gerald's car. The loan was secured by what was called a cross-collateralization rider, which meant that if Marcus defaulted, Apex Capital automatically claimed not just the primary assets of his firm, but also any collateral he had personally pledged, including his equity stake in his in-law's private equity group. Marcus had signed that rider 18 months ago, without reading it the way a man who thinks he's invincible signs anything. Diane said, "If we file the demand now, his entire financial existence vaporizes by close of business. The Whittingtons will lose their anchor investment." The consortium will sue. He'll face criminal exposure. Gerald looked at Henry. Henry didn't blink. We file it at 9:59, after I hand him the original letter. He needs to understand that this isn't revenge from a stranger. It's the bill for a lifetime of pretending I was invisible. At 9:45, Henry walked into the lobby of Apex Solutions carrying a mop. Not the cheap industrial kind, but the very first wooden-handled mop he'd ever bought with his own money when Marcus started kindergarten. He'd kept it oiled and clean for 32 years as a reminder of what you lose when you let pride erase your gratitude. The receptionist tried to stop him, but Henry's face stopped her first. He rode the elevator to the 8th floor where Marcus was already screaming at his chief financial officer about the missing term sheet, perspiration bleeding through his handmade suit jacket. Henry didn't knock, he just pushed open the glass door and set the mop against the wall. Marcus's CFO had the sense to leave. Marcus stared at his father with the wide, unblinking shock of a man who has just realized the stage has no exit. Before he could speak, Henry pulled the letter from his pocket and placed it on the desk. "You don't get to talk yet," he said. "You talked at the wedding. You talked at the rehearsal. You've been talking your whole life, and I've been holding the floor still so you wouldn't trip. Today you listen." He told Marcus about the Tuesday mornings. He told him about Gerald Apex, sitting alone in that break room in 1994, facing a hostile takeover that would have killed Apex Global and left 2,000 people without jobs. How Henry, the janitor, had quietly pointed out a flaw in the aggressor's supply chain because he'd cleaned the files of the legal team that were too careless to shred their drafts. How Gerald had used that insight to survive, and how, as a thank you, Gerald had secretly transferred 2% of the company's private shares into Henry's name in a blind trust that had been compounding for nearly 20 years. Henry Cole was not a janitor who happened to know a billionaire. He was the third largest individual shareholder of Apex Global, a man whose net worth had quietly crossed $14 million a decade ago and had since grown to something north of $42 million. He just never touched it. He never moved out of his house, never upgraded his truck, never put on a suit that wasn't borrowed for a wedding. "I wore this life," Henry said, his voice level, "because I wanted you to build yours without leaning on mine. But you didn't just lean on it, Marcus. You stood on my shoulders and pretended I wasn't part of your view." He told him about the loan. He told him it was issued because Gerald had called him personally and said, "Henry, your boy has real talent. Let me give him the fuel. You stay in the shadows if you want, but this one's from you." Marcus had received a $4.7 million lifeline, and he had spent it believing it came from anonymous investors, because that's exactly what Henry had instructed Gerald to arrange, an invisible safety net that Marcus could never connect back to the man with the mop. And now that safety net was a noose, because the same man Marcus had humiliated at his own wedding held the only copy of the acceleration clause that could be triggered with a single phone call. Marcus's face was the color of spoiled milk. He opened his mouth, and the first thing that came out wasn't "I'm sorry." It was "You tricked me." Henry didn't flinch. He'd expected that. Men who are terrified always reach for blame before they reach for accountability. "I didn't trick you," he said. "I protected you from yourself, the way I've done every single day since your mother died. The question you need to ask is why you decided that protection looked like weakness." Right then, the intercom on Marcus's desk buzzed, and a panicked assistant announced that a legal courier from Apex Capital was in the lobby with a demand filing that required his personal signature. Marcus turned to his father, eyes wide. Henry just picked up the mop he'd leaned against the wall. "That's the acceleration clause," he said. Diane's people are serving it right now to Eliza's father's office, and a copy is landing on the desk of the Attorney General's Commercial Fraud Division in 45 minutes. Unless, Marcus grabbed the edge of his desk. Unless what? Henry looked at the mop in his hands, at the smooth wood worn soft by decades of labor, and then he looked back at his son. Unless you walk down to that lobby, sign the document accepting full personal liability, and then come with me to the Whittingtons' estate. You're going to sit at their table, you're going to tell them exactly what you did, and you're going to look at your wife and tell her the truth about the man who raised you. He paused, letting that land. The only way out of this isn't money. It's honesty. And the only man who can teach you how to be honest right now is the worthless janitor you tried to erase. Marcus's breathing had gone shallow, and somewhere behind the terror, something else flickered. The memory of a 5-year-old boy watching his father come home at midnight, still smelling of floor wax, sitting on the edge of his bed and reading him a story about a brave mouse who never gave up. The boy hadn't been ashamed then. The shame had been learned later, slowly in rooms full of expensive furniture and people who measured worth by the logos on their watch faces. That shame had built a wall, and Henry had just walked through it, carrying the original mop that had paid for every single one of those logoed watches. And now, the next move belonged to Marcus, because Gerald Apex was waiting on the ground floor with a notary and a camera crew hired to document the moment for the fraud investigators, and the only person who could stop the entire machine was the same young man who had lifted a microphone and called his father worthless, in front of everyone he was trying to impress. But before Marcus could answer, his office door swung open again, and Eliza Whittington walked in. Her face was not tear-stained anymore. It was the face of a woman who had just read the full Apex Capital loan file, which her father had forwarded to her, and she was holding her phone with the screen turned outward, so Marcus could see exactly what his in-laws knew. She looked at Henry, and I want you to remember this moment because everything from here forward hinges on it. She didn't look at her husband. She looked at the janitor and said 3 words that changed the axis of the entire room. I believe you. 3 words. Not said to Marcus, but to the man in the borrowed suit holding a mop against the wall. Eliza Whittington had just read the full loan file. She'd seen the origination documents, Gerald Apex's signature, and the letter of intent that named Henry Cole as the guarantor of last resort. Her father had forwarded the file with a note that simply said, "We've been lied to by someone who called himself an orphan when his father was still alive." Eliza wasn't crying now. She was standing in the doorway of her husband's corner office with her phone still extended, and the screen showed a single sentence from her father's email. "The janitor is the only one who can save your husband. Ask him why he would bother." Marcus took a step toward her, hands raised in that placating gesture men use when they think a woman is overreacting. "Eliza, let me explain." She cut him off without raising her voice. "Explain what? That you've been telling me your father was dead? That you borrowed millions from a man who cleans floors and then humiliated him in front of my entire family? Is that what you're about to explain?" Marcus's mouth opened and closed twice. Henry didn't move. He'd learned long ago that some truths need air, not commentary. And then Gerald Apex walked in. Not like a billionaire, not like a CEO, but like a man who has spent decades mastering the art of entering a room exactly when his presence would cause the most damage. He was followed by Diane carrying a leather-bound folder thick enough to stop a bullet, and a notary who set up a portable printer on Marcus's conference table without asking permission. "You have until 11 o'clock, Gerald said, looking directly at Marcus. At 11:01, the acceleration clause triggers automatically. The demand has already been drafted. The press release has already been written. The only thing missing is the name of the person who hit send. Marcus looked at his father with something that wasn't quite desperation yet, but was close. "Dad, you can stop this. You're a shareholder. You're the guarantor. Tell him to stand down." Henry set the mop against the wall carefully, making sure it was balanced before he turned back. "I am the guarantor. That means if you default, I pay. Every cent, $42 million of silent shares, and a blind trust your mother and I built before she got sick. I'd lose more than you've ever earned." He paused so the arithmetic could land. "I'm willing to lose it." The air left the room. Eliza's hand dropped to her side, phone forgotten. Marcus's CFO, who had been listening through the glass wall, turned and walked toward the elevator. Gerald's face didn't change, because he already knew that Henry had made this decision 48 hours earlier, sitting alone on his front porch at 2 in the morning, listening to the sound of a neighbor's dog barking at nothing. "It's not about the money, son. It never was. I'll happily burn every dollar of that trust if it means you finally understand that a man's worth isn't determined by which side of the mop he stands on. But here's the thing about cornered men. They don't surrender. They double down." And what Marcus did next was something even Gerald hadn't prepared for. He turned to Eliza, not with an apology, but with a counterattack. "Your father's firm is just as dirty. You think the Whittingtons built their empire on clean deals? I have records, Eliza, deferred maintenance payments on properties they knew were sinking. Subprime construction loans that were packaged and sold to pension funds in Ohio. Your father has been running a shell game for 15 years, and I have every single document cataloged because I'm the one who structured them." The revelation hit the room like a seismic wave. Eliza staggered, catching herself on the doorframe. "What are you talking about?" Marcus laughed, but it was the wrong kind of laugh. The kind that comes out when despair fills the lungs and sounds like a joke. "You thought I married you just for love? Your father needed a clean front man to keep the sec off his trail. I was that front man. Every investment your family made in my firm was actually a money laundering pass-through for subprime fallout. The logistics startup I bet on? That wasn't a bet. It was a garbage truck for bad debt. And your father signed off on every single transaction." Henry looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at Diane. Diane picked up her phone and stepped into the hallway. Because this had just stopped being about a wedding toast. This was now about systemic fraud that reached from a boutique investment firm in Manhattan all the way up to a private equity group that managed nearly $2 billion in institutional capital. The collateral damage, if this blew open, would be catastrophic. Pension funds, endowments, retirement accounts for teachers and firefighters and people who had never heard of anyone in this room. Marcus hadn't just lied to his father. He'd been laundering money for a financial crime family, and his marriage was the bridge. Eliza's voice came out like broken glass. "You used me." Marcus didn't deny it. He just stood there, with his shoulders back like a soldier who had already been shot and was waiting for the second bullet to finish the job. "Your father used you first," he said. "I just used the situation. That's what everyone in this world does. Your father, your mother, every single person who sat at that wedding and laughed when I called my dad a janitor. They were laughing because they thought I was finally shedding the last part of me that was real. And I was. I was shedding the only part of me that mattered." Something shifted in Henry's chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. The boy he'd raised had spent so long trying to belong to a world that would never accept him that he'd destroyed every bridge back to the one person who actually did. Marcus wasn't evil. He was lost. And the man who had mopped floors to feed that boy knew the difference between those two things intimately. Gerald stepped forward. The acceleration clause still triggers unless the full balance is settled by end of business. That's 4.7 million. But I'm not unreasonable. I'll hold off the fraud referral to the DA if two things happen. One, Marcus cooperates fully with whatever investigation the Whittingtons' legal team mounts. Two, Henry gets a public apology at a press conference where Marcus tells the world exactly who cleaned whose floors. Marcus's face was ashen. A press conference. You want me to humiliate myself? Gerald looked at him without pity. You humiliated yourself the moment you opened your mouth at your own wedding. I'm just giving you a chance to rewrite the headline. Because here's what you don't know. There's a reporter from the Wall Street Journal sitting in the lobby right now. She's been working on an expose about the Whittington Group for 6 months. Your father-in-law's shell game is already crumbling. The only reason it hasn't gone public is because your wife's family has been feeding her sanitized information. Today, she's about to get the full file. Eliza's hand went to her mouth. My father, Gerald, nodded grimly. Your father is already lawyered up. The SEC raided his office at 9 this morning. The only reason you're not in handcuffs right now is because I called in a favor with a federal judge who happens to be an old friend of mine. And I asked for a 1-hour window to let this family sort itself out before the agents arrive. That window closes at 11:15. This was the worst turn moment. The entire house of cards was collapsing. And Henry Cole, the man who had been invisible his whole life, was standing at the center of the wreckage with the power to decide who walked out and who got buried. Because the SEC investigation wasn't just about the Whittingtons. It would sweep up Marcus too, unless Henry used his shareholder position and his personal relationship with Gerald to carve out a cooperation deal. The mop in the corner wasn't just a symbol. It was the evidence of a life lived so far below suspicion that no investigator would ever look in the direction of the janitor. Henry Cole was the most powerful person in the building precisely because no one had ever noticed him. He picked up the mop, twisted the handle until a hidden compartment opened, and pulled out a flash drive he'd been carrying for 10 years. In it were the original bank records of every Tuesday morning conversation, translated into quiet, methodical documentation. Not because he was spying, but because Gerald had asked him to keep notes. Gerald knew that one day the Whittingtons would need to be unwound, and Henry had been the only person in the company with no financial footprint, no digital trail, and no motive for profit. The flash drive held the forensic accounting that would convict the Whittingtons, exonerate the innocent, and prove that Marcus, for all his cruelty, had been a pawn in a much larger game. He held it up. Here's the choice, son. We walk into that lobby together. You apologize to that reporter before she publishes her story. You tell her about your father, the janitor, and you tell her about the fraud you witnessed from the inside. You cooperate with the SEC, and you testify against your father-in-law, or you take the fall alone. I'll walk out of here. Gerald triggers the acceleration clause, your company dies, your wife leaves you, and you go to prison for money laundering. I'll visit you. I'll still be your father. But I won't save you. That's the difference between me and everyone else in this room. I'm offering you rescue, not ransom. The clock on the conference room wall read 11:02, 13 minutes until the SEC window closed. The notary had finished setting up and was waiting with a document that would transform Marcus's cooperation into a binding legal agreement. Eliza was staring at her husband with a face that held no love, just the exhausted recognition that she'd married a stranger. Marcus looked at his father, then at the flash drive, then at his own reflection in the glass wall. Outside, the city was carrying on like none of this was happening. Inside, a family was being rebuilt or demolished by the next words out of a son's mouth. And here's the thing you need to remember about gifts that cost everything. Henry Cole wasn't offering his son a way out of trouble. He was offering him a way back into a life where the man who pushed a mop wasn't a source of shame, but the only spine he'd ever had. Marcus just had to say one word. One word, and the avalanche either stopped or swallowed him whole. Yes, Marcus said it so quietly the notary made him repeat it. Yes, I'll cooperate. And just like that, the avalanche didn't stop, but it changed direction. Gerald nodded once, the kind of nod a man gives when he's watched enough boardrooms crumble to know that a single word can redirect an entire future. Diane opened the folder, slid the cooperation agreement across the table, and Marcus signed his name with a hand that shook only on the final stroke. The clock read 11:08. They walked out of the office together. Henry carried the mop, not as a prop, but because he genuinely intended to return it to his custodial closet later. Eliza walked beside him, her arm linked through his, not her husband's. Marcus followed a few steps behind, like a man being led somewhere he doesn't deserve to go. In the elevator, nobody spoke. The silence was the kind that cleanses, the way a hard rain scrubs dust from the air. The lobby of Apex Solutions was no longer a gleaming monument to ambition. It was a staging ground. The Wall Street Journal reporter, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Okonkwo, stood near the reception desk with her phone already recording. Beside her were two federal agents who had arrived early, waiting for the 11:15 deadline. Gerald walked up to them and said simply, "The window stands." He's cooperating. Patricia's eyes shifted to Marcus, then to Henry, then to the mop. She was too good a reporter to interrupt the story that was about to write itself. Marcus stepped forward. The press conference that Gerald had demanded became, in that moment, something less orchestrated and more raw. Patricia held up her phone, and Marcus began to speak. He didn't use notes. He didn't hide behind corporate language. He talked about his father. He talked about the Tuesday mornings he never knew existed, about the $42 million his father had silently accumulated while wearing shoes with worn soles, about the loan that was never meant to be a weapon but became one anyway. He talked about his own shame, the way it had calcified into cruelty, and how he had stood at his wedding and called the most honorable man he'd ever known a worthless janitor because he was terrified that his new world would reject him if they knew where he came from. Then he started talking about the Whittingtons. He laid out the shell game, the subprime construction loans, the money laundering, everything. Eliza stood to the side, her jaw set, and when Marcus finished, she stepped forward and added her own statement. She didn't defend her father. She didn't defend her husband. She said, "My family profited from deception for 15 years. I didn't know the full scope, but I benefited from it. I'm cooperating fully, and I'll testify if needed." The agents exchanged a glance. They'd been expecting resistance. They got surrender. The SEC filed formal charges against Charles Whittington the following morning. His arrest made national news, but the bigger story, the one Patricia filed that evening, was about the janitor who owned 14% of a global logistics firm and had spent 3 decades cleaning its hallways because he didn't want his son to grow up thinking money defined a man. The story went viral, not as a financial scandal piece, but as a story about fathers and sons, about invisible dignity, about the quiet force of a man who refused to cash in his integrity. But the legal machinery was only half the resolution. The other half was what happened in the days and weeks that followed, in the quiet spaces where the cameras weren't present. Marcus's firm was dissolved. The $4.7 million loan was restructured into a personal debt held solely by Henry, who used a fraction of his trust to clear it, not as a bailout, but as a lesson. "You'll pay me back," he told Marcus, "not with money. You'll pay me back by spending every Tuesday morning for the next year in the break room on the executive floor with me and Gerald. You'll listen, you'll learn, and you'll mop the floor afterward. Because that's where it starts." Marcus showed up. The first Tuesday he was stiff and silent, a man wearing humility like an ill-fitting suit. But Gerald didn't lecture. He just poured coffee into 3 styrofoam cups and talked about baseball, about logistics, about the time he almost lost everything, and a janitor saved him with a supply chain insight gleaned from shredded documents. The second Tuesday, Marcus asked a question. By the 8th Tuesday, he was making them laugh. By the 20th, he had started his own small consulting firm, one that specialized in fraud prevention for small businesses, built on the lessons he'd learned from watching his father-in-law's empire collapse and his own career implode. He worked out of a tiny office with no view, and he paid his father back in monthly installments that Henry quietly donated to a scholarship fund for custodians' children. Eliza and Marcus separated after 6 months. She needed time, and he understood. But she continued to visit Henry. She'd show up at his house on Sunday afternoons with grocery bags and cook dinner in his small kitchen, and they'd talk about forgiveness as a process, not a moment. She told him once, "You're the only father I have left now. Mine is in a federal prison in Pennsylvania." Henry took her hand and said, "Then you'll always have a seat at my table." It wasn't sentimental. It was just true. Gerald Apex retired 6 months after the story broke. At his retirement party, held in the same break room where it all began, he handed Henry a bronze plaque that read, "To the man who cleaned more than floors." Henry hung it in his living room, right above the mop that had started it all. The two men still meet for coffee every Tuesday, though now it's at a diner near Henry's house that has a jukebox and the best pecan pie in the county. Gerald is teaching Henry how to fly fish. Henry is teaching Gerald how to grow heirloom tomatoes. And here is the surprising detail I promised you, the one that even the Wall Street Journal never found out. 3 weeks after the press conference, Henry received a letter at his home. It was from Stuart Hale, the brother of Victor Marsh, the man Gerald had once vanquished, the father of a young man who had tried to extort the Colton family in that other story. That letter was not about revenge. It was about recognition. Stuart had read Patricia Okonkwo's article and recognized something in Henry's quiet dignity that mirrored his own late brother's version of events, but with a crucial difference. Stuart wrote, "I spent 30 years believing my brother was a victim. After reading your story, I began to question everything. I pulled the original records you sent all those years ago. I reread the affidavits. I realized the story I'd been told was a lie. I'm writing to apologize. Not to Gerald, not to Frank Colton, but to you, because you represent the kind of man my brother pretended to be and wasn't. I hope your son knows what he has." Henry wrote back. Not with anger, not with vindication, but with an invitation. "Come to our Tuesday morning coffee. Gerald will be there. I'll be there. There's 1 seat left. It's been empty for 30 years. I think it might fit you." Stuart Hale showed up 3 weeks later. He walked into that diner, saw Henry and Gerald sitting in a corner booth, and hesitated. Gerald stood up first. "I didn't hate your brother," he said. "I hated what he did. Those are 2 different things." Stuart sat down. They talked for 4 hours. By the end, a wound that had festered for 3 decades had begun to heal. Not because of a settlement or a court order, but because one man had refused to let his son's cruelty make him cruel. And that quiet refusal had rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. Marcus's new consulting firm now occupies a single floor of a building that Henry quietly purchased years ago with his dividends. Marcus doesn't know it yet. He'll find out when his lease comes up for renewal, and the landlord sends him a letter explaining that the building's owner has reduced his rent to exactly $1 per month, payable in person, every first Monday, at a diner in Beckley. The letter is signed H. Cole, custodian and owner. Because that's the thing about men like Henry, they don't stop building. They just change what they're constructing. At first, he built a life sturdy enough to hold a grieving boy. Then, he built an invisible fortune. Then, he built a bridge back for a son who had burned every crossing. And now, in the quiet years that remain, he's building a table big enough for everyone who's willing to sit down and be honest. The floor is clean. The coffee is hot. And the man at the head of the table is no longer invisible to anyone. There is a particular cruelty in being seen as a tool rather than a person. Henry Cole understood that cruelty intimately. He lived inside it for 3 decades, not because he had no other choice, but because he refused to let the world's blindness determine his own sense of worth. That's the quiet miracle at the center of this story. He didn't need Marcus to suffer. He didn't need revenge. He needed his son to see him, really see him. And he was willing to lose everything to make that happen. And here's the question that lingers long after the headlines fade. How many people do we pass every day without truly seeing them? The janitor in the lobby, the driver on the highway, the quiet neighbor who grows tomatoes and never talks about where he's been. Henry Cole was a millionaire hidden in plain sight, but his value had nothing to do with his bank account. It had everything to do with the way he showed up, Tuesday after Tuesday, for a man who was supposed to be his boss, but became his brother. That's the part of the story I keep coming back to. Not the sec raid, not the press conference, not even the letter from Stuart Hale. It's the simple image of 2 men in a break room, one with coffee and one with a mop, talking about baseball while the world outside measured worth in stock options and corner offices. Gerald Apex once said that Henry was the only person in the building who didn't want something from him. But that's not quite accurate. Henry did want something. He wanted connection, the kind that can't be bought or leveraged. He was the richest man in that building long before his trust fund matured. So if you take one thing from this story, let it be this: the people you dismiss today may be the ones holding the keys to your entire future tomorrow. Not because they're secretly powerful, but because every human being carries a weight you can't see. A story you haven't heard, and a dignity that deserves respect whether they're wearing a tailored suit or a gray custodial uniform. If this story hit you the way it hit me, if it made you think about the people you might be overlooking in your own life, then do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Drop a comment below. Tell us about someone in your life who showed up quietly, without fanfare, and changed your world just by being there. We read those comments, and honestly, they keep us going. You're already part of this community. Now be the reason someone else finds their way here. Share this story. Hit that like button. And as always, thank you for spending your time with us. The floor is clean, the coffee is hot, and the table is always set for those who are ready to see the world differently. I'll see you in the next one.